Hi, everyone, and Kate back for another quarantine ghost story reading for you. And this is the first part out of three. So I doubt that I would sit down during the weekend to film the third part. So you might have to wait until Monday if you are paying attention to this and are eager to hear the next part. I'll definitely make sure to complete this. But I think it will most likely be happening on Monday because this is a longer story. And I am reading out of the Virago book of Victorian ghost stories. And this story is called Winthrop's Adventure by Vernon Lee. And Vernon Lee was a novelist who was raised in France by British expat parents. And she was best known, though, for her ghost stories, her supernatural tales. And this is one of them. There's another one that I saw online. I can't remember the name of it, but the title just sounded so intriguing. So if I like this one, I might look up that one as well. But the story is called Winthrop's Adventure. So I will be reading the first two chapters today. Chapter 1. All the intimates at Villa S knew Julian Winthrop to be an odd sort of creature. But I am sure no one ever expected from him such an eccentric scene as that which took place on the first Wednesday of last September. Winthrop had been a constant visitor at the Countess S.'s villa ever since his arrival in Florence, and the better we knew, the more we liked his fantastic character. Although quite young, he had shown very considerable talent for painting, but everyone seemed to agree that this talent would never come to anything. His nature was too impressionable, too mobile for steady work, and he cared too much for all kinds of art to devote himself exclusively to any one. Above all, he had too ungovernable a fancy, and too uncontrollable a love of detail to fix and complete any impression in an artistic shape. His ideas and fancies were constantly shifting and changing like the shapes in a kaleidoscope, and their instability and variety were the chief sources of his pleasure. All that he did and thought and said had an irresistible tendency to become arabesque, feelings and moods gliding strangely into each other, thoughts and images growing into inextricable tangles. Just as when he played, he passed insensibly from one fragment to another totally incongruous, and when he drew one form merged into another beneath his pencil. His head was like his sketchbook, full of delightful scraps of color and quaint, graceful forms, none finished, one on the top of the other. Leaves growing out of heads, houses astride on animals, scraps of melodies noted down across scraps of verse, gleanings from all quarters, all pleasing, and all jumbled into a fantastic, useless, but very delightful whole. In short, Winthrop's artistic talent was frittered away by his love of the picturesque, and his career was spoilt by his love of adventure. But such as he was almost a work of art, a living arabesque himself. On this particular Wednesday, we were all seated out on the terrace of the Villa S at Bellosguardo, enjoying the beautiful serene yellow moonlight and the delightful coolness after an intensely hot day. The Countess S., who was a great musician, was trying over a violin sonata with one of her friends in the drawing room, of which the doors opened onto the terrace. Winthrop, who had been particularly gay all evening, had cleared away the plates and cups from the tea table, and had pulled out his sketchbook and begun drawing in his drowsy, irrelevant fashion. Acanthus leaves uncurling into sirens' tails, satyrs growing out of passion flowers, little Dutch mannikins in tailcoats, and pigtails peeping out of tulip leaves under his whimsical pencil, while he listened partly to the music within, partly to the conversation without. When the violin sonata had been tried over, passage by passage, sufficiently often, the Countess, instead of returning to us on the terrace, addressed us from the drawing-room. "Remain where you are," she said. "I want you to hear an old air which I discovered last week among a heap of rubbish in my father-in-law's lumber room. I think it quite a treasure, as good as a wrought iron ornament found among the heap of old rusty nails, or a piece of jubeo majolica found among cracked coffee cups. It is very beautiful to my mind. Just listen." The Countess was an uncommonly fine singer, without much voice, and not at all emotional, but highly delicate and refined in execution, and with a great knowledge of music. The air which she deemed beautiful could not fail to really be so. but it was so totally different from all we moderns are accustomed to that it seemed, with its exquisitely finished phrases, its delicate vocal twirls and spirals, its symmetrically ordered ornaments, to take one into quite another world of musical feeling, a feeling too subdued and artistic, too subtly and cunningly balanced to move us more than superficially. Indeed, it could not move at all, for it expressed no particular state of feeling. It was difficult to say whether it was sad or cheerful. All that could be said was that it was singularly graceful and delicate. This is how the piece affected me, and, I believe, in less degree, all the rest of our party. But, turning towards Winthrop, I was surprised at seeing how very strong an impression its very first bars had made on him. He was seated at the table, his back turned towards me, but I could see that he had suddenly stopped drawing and was listening with intense eagerness. At one moment, I almost fancied I saw his hand tremble as it lay on his sketchbook, as if he were breathing spasmodically. I pulled my chair near his. There could be no doubt. His whole frame was quivering. "Winthrop," I whispered. He paid no attention to me, but continued listening intently, and his hand unconsciously crumpled up the sheet he had drawn on. "Winthrop," I repeated, touching his shoulder. "Be quiet," he answered quickly, as if shaking me off. "Let me listen." There was something almost fierce in his manner, and this intense emotion caused by a piece which did not move any of the rest of us struck me as being very odd. He remained with his head between his hands till the end. The piece concluded with a very intricate and beautiful passage of execution, and with a curious sort of sighing fall from a high note onto a lower one, short and repeated at various intervals with a lovely effect. "Bravo! Beautiful!" cried everyone. "A real treasure, so quaint and so elegant and so admirably sung." I looked at Winthrop. He had turned round. His face was flushed, and he leaned against his chair as if oppressed by emotion. The Countess returned to the terrace. "I am glad you like the piece," she said. "It is a graceful thing. Good heavens, Mr. Winthrop!" she suddenly interrupted herself. "What is the matter? Are you ill?" For ill he certainly did look. He rose and, making an effort, answered in a husky, uncertain voice, "It's nothing. I suddenly felt cold. I think I'll go in, or rather, no, I'll stay. What is that air that you have just sung?" "That air?" she answered absently, for the sudden change in Winthrop's manner put everything else out of her thoughts. "That air? Oh, it is by a very forgotten composer of the name of Barbella, who lived somewhere about the year 1780. It was evident that she considered this question as a sort of mask to his sudden emotion. "Would you let me see the score?" he asked quickly. "Certainly. Will you come into the drawing-room? I left it on the piano." The piano candles were still lit, and as they stood there she watched his face with as much curiosity as myself. But Winthrop took no notice of either of us. He had eagerly snatched the score, and was looking at it in a fixed, vacant way. When he looked up, his face was ashy. He handed me the score mechanically. It was an old yellow blurred manuscript in some now disused clef, and the initial words, written in a grand, florid style, were "Si Regina, io son pastore." The Countess was still under the impression that Winthrop was trying to hide his agitation by pretending great interest in the song. But I, having seen his extraordinary emotion during its performance, could not doubt of the connection between them. "You say the piece is very rare," said Winthrop. Do you think that no one besides yourself is acquainted with it at present?" "Of course I can't affirm that," answered the Countess, "but this much I know, that Professor G., who is one of the most learned of musical authorities, and to whom I showed the piece, had heard neither of it nor of its composer, and that he positively says it exists in no musical archives in Italy or in Paris." "Then how?" I asked. "Do you know that it is of about the year 1780? By the style, Professor G. compared it at my request with some compositions of that day, and the style perfectly coincides." "You think, then," continued Winthrop slowly, but eagerly, "you think, then, that no one else sings it at present?" "I should say not. At least it seems highly unlikely." Winthrop was silent, and continued looking at the score, but, as it seemed to me, mechanically. Some of the rest of the party had meanwhile entered the drawing-room. "Did you notice Mr. Winthrop's extraordinary behavior?" whispered a lady to the Countess. "What has happened to him?" "I can't conceive. He is excessively impressionable, but I don't see how that piece could impress him at all. It is a sweet thing, but so unemotional," I answered. "That piece," replied the Countess. "You don't suppose that piece has anything to do with it?" "Indeed I do. It has everything to do with it. In short, I noticed that from the very first notes it violently affected him." "Then all these inquiries about it are perfectly genuine." "It cannot be the piece itself which has moved him, and he can scarcely have heard it before. It's very odd. There is certainly something the matter with him." There certainly was. Winthrop was excessively pale and agitated, all the more so as he perceived that he had become an object of universal curiosity. He evidently wished to make his escape, but was afraid of doing so too suddenly. He was standing behind the piano, looking mechanically at the old score. "Have you ever heard that piece before, Mr. Winthrop?" said the Countess, unable to restrain her curiosity. He looked up, much discomposed, and answered after a moment's hesitation, "How can I have heard it, since you are the sole possessor of it?" "The sole possessor? Oh, I never said that. I thought it unlikely, but perhaps there is some other. Tell me, is there another? Where did you hear that piece before?" "I did not say I had heard it before," he rejoined hurriedly. "But have you or have you not?" persisted the Countess. "I never have," he answered decidedly, but immediately reddened as if conscious of prevarication. "Don't ask me any questions," he added quickly. "It worries me." And in a minute he was off. We looked at each other in mute astonishment. This astonishing behavior, this mixture of concealment and rudeness, above all the violent excitement in which Winthrop had evidently been, and his unaccountable eagerness respecting the piece which the Countess had sung, all this entirely baffled our efforts at discovery. "There is some mystery at the bottom of it," we said, and further we could not get. Next evening, as we were seated once more in the Countess's drawing-room, we of course reverted to Winthrop's extraordinary behavior. "Do you think he will return soon?" asked one of us. "I should think he would rather let the matter blow over and wait till we had forgotten his absurdity," answered the Countess. At that moment the door opened, and Winthrop entered. He seemed confused and at a loss what to say. He did not answer our trivial remarks, but suddenly burst out, as if with a great effort. "I have come to beg you to forgive my last night's behavior. Forgive my rudeness and my want of openness, but I could not have explained anything then. That piece, you must know, has given me a great shock." "A great shock? And how could it give you a shock?" we all exclaimed. "You surely don't mean that so prim a piece as that could have affected you?" asked the Countess's sister. "If it did," added the Countess, "it is the greatest miracle music ever worked." "It is difficult to explain the matter," hesitated Winthrop, "but, in short, this piece gave me a shock because as soon as I heard the first bars, I recognized it." "And you told me you had never heard it before!" exclaimed the Countess indignantly. "I know I did. It was not true, but neither was it quite false. All I can say is that I knew the piece, whether I had heard it before or not. I knew it, in fact." He dashed out, "You will think me mad, but I had long doubted whether the piece existed at all, and I was so moved just because your performance proved that it did exist. Look here." And pulling the sketchbook from his pocket, he was just about to open it when he stopped. "Have you got the notes of that piece?" he asked hurriedly. "Here they are," said the Countess, she handed him the old roll of music. He did not look at it, but turned over the leaves of his sketchbook. "See," he said after a minute, "look at this." And he pushed the open sketchbook across the table to us. On it, among a lot of sketches, were some roughly ruled lines, with some notes scrawled in pencil, and the words, "Si Regina io pastor sone." "Why, this is the beginning of the very air!" exclaimed the Countess. "How did you get this?" We compared the notes in the sketchbook with those on the score. They were the same, but in another clef and tone. Winthrop sat opposite, looking doggedly at us. After a moment he remarked, "They are the same notes, are they not? Well, this pencil scrawl was done in July of last year, while the ink of this score has been dry 90 years. Yet when I wrote down these notes, I swear I did not know that any such score existed, and until yesterday I disbelieved it." "Then," remarked one of the party, "there are only two explanations. Either you composed this melody yourself, not knowing that someone else had done so 90 years ago, or you heard that piece without knowing what it was." "Explanation?" cried Winthrop contemptuously. "Why, don't you see that it is just what needs explaining? Of course, I either composed it myself or heard it, but which of the two was it?" We remained much humbled and silenced. "This is a very astonishing puzzle," remarked the Countess, "and I think it useless to rack our brains about it, since Mr. Winthrop is the only person who can explain it. We don't and can't understand. He can and must explain it himself." I don't know," she added, "whether there is any reason for not explaining the mystery to us, but if not, I wish you would." "There is no reason," he answered, "except that you would set me down as a maniac. The story is so absurd a one, you will never believe me, and yet—" "Then there is a story at the bottom of it?" exclaimed the Countess. "What is it? Can't you tell us it?" Winthrop gave a sort of deprecatory shrug and trifled with the paper cutters and dog-eared books on the table. "Well," he said at last, "if you really wish to know, why, perhaps I might as well tell it you. Only don't tell me afterwards that I am mad. Nothing can alter the fact of the real existence of the piece, and as long as you continue to regard it as unique, I cannot but regard my adventure as being true." We were afraid lest he might slip away through all these deprecatory premisings, and that after all we might hear no story whatever, so we summoned him to begin at once, and he, keeping his head well in the shadow of the lampshade and scribbling as usual on his sketchbook, began his narrative, at first slowly and hesitatingly, with plentiful interruptions, but he grew more interested in it, becoming extremely rapid and dramatic, and exceedingly minute in details. Chapter 2. "You must know," said Winthrop, "that about a year and a half ago I spent the autumn with some cousins of mine, rambling about Lombardy, and poking into all sorts of nooks and corners. We made the acquaintance of Monsieur, of a highly learned and highly snuffy old gentleman. I believe he was a count or a marquess, who went by the name of Maestro Fadiesis, Master F. Sharp, and who possessed a very fine collection of things musical, a perfect museum. He had a handsome old palace, which was literally tumbling to pieces, and of which the whole first floor was taken up by his collections. His old MSS, his precious missals, his papyri, his autographs, his black-letter books, his prints and pictures, his innumerable ivory inlaid harpsichords and ebony-fretted lutes and viols, lived in fine, spacious rooms with carved oaken ceilings and painted window frames, while he lived in some miserable little garret to the back, on what I can't say, but I should judge by the spectral appearance of his old woman servant and of a half-imbecile boy who served him, on nothing more substantial than bean husks and warm water. They seemed to suffer from this diet, but I suspect that their master must have absorbed some mysterious vivifying fluid from his MSS and his old instruments, for he seemed to be made of steel, and was the most provokingly active old fellow, keeping one's nerves in perpetual irritation by his friskiness and volubility. He cared for nothing in the wide world save his collections. He had cut down tree after tree. He had sold field after field and farm after farm. He had sold his furniture, his tapestries, his plate, his family papers, his own clothes. He would have taken the tiles off his roof and the glass out of his windows to buy some score of the 16th century, some illuminated mass book, or some Cremonese fiddle. For music itself, I firmly believe he cared not a jot, and regarded it as useful only inasmuch as if it had produced the objects of his passion, the things which he could spend all his life in dusting, labeling, counting, and cataloguing, for not a chord, not a note was ever heard in his house, and he would have died rather than spend a soldino on going to the opera. My cousin, who is music mad after a fashion, quickly secured the old gentleman's goodwill by accepting 100 commissions for the obtaining of catalogues and the attending of sales, and we were consequently permitted daily to enter that strange, silent house full of musical things, and to examine its contents at our leisure, always, however, under old Fadiesi's vigilant supervision. The house, its contents, and proprietor formed a grotesque world, which had a certain charm for me. I used often to fancy that the silence could be only apparent, that, as soon as the master had drawn his bolts and gone off to bed, all this slumbering music would awake, that the pictures of dead musicians would slip out of their frames, the glass cases fly open, the big paunched inlaid lutes turned into safety Flemish burghers with brocaded doublets, the yellow, faded sides of the Cremonese bass viols expand into the stiff satin hoops of powdered ladies, and the little ribbed mandolins put forth a party-colored leg and a bushy-haired head, and hop about as Provençal court dwarfs or Renaissance pages, while the Egyptian sistrum and fief players would slip from off the hieroglyphics of the papyrus, and all the parchment palimpsests of Greek musicians turned into chlamys-robed aulites. And then the kettle drums and tam-tams would strike up, The organ tubes would suddenly be filled with sound, the old gilded harpsichords would jingle like fury, the old chapel master yonder, in his peruke and furred robe, would beat time on his picture frame, and the whole motley company set to dancing, until, all of a sudden, old Fa Daises, awakened by the noise and suspecting thieves, would rush in wildly in his dressing gown, a three-wicked kitchen lamp in one hand, and his great-grandfather's court sword in the other, when all the dancers and players would start and slide back into their frames and cases. I should not, however, have gone so often to the old gentleman's museum had my cousin not exhorted me from the promise of a watercolor sketch of a picture of Palestrina, which, for some reason or other, she, for the cousin was a lady, which explains my docility, chose to consider as particularly authentic. It was a monster, a daub, which I shuddered at, and my admiration for Palestrina would have rather induced me to burn the hideous, blear-eyed, shoulderless thing, but musical folk have their whims, and hers was to hang a copy of this monstrosity over her grand piano. So I acceded, took my drawing block and easel, and set off for Fa Daises' place. This palace was a queer old place, full of ups and downs and twistings and turnings, and in going to the only tolerably lighted room of the house, whither the delightful subject for my brush had been transported for my convenience, we had to pass through a narrow and wriggling corridor somewhere in the heart of the building. In doing so, we passed by a door up some steps. "By the way," exclaimed old Fa Daises, "have I shown you this? 'Tis of no great value, but still, as a painter, it may interest you." He mounted the steps, pushed open the door, which was ajar, and ushered me into a small, bleak, whitewashed lumber room, peopled with broken bookshelves, crazy music desks, and unsteady chairs and tables, the whole covered by a goodly layer of dust. On the walls were a few time-stained portraits in corselets and bobby wigs, and the senatorial ancestors of Fa Daises, who had to make room for the bookshelves and instrument cases, filling the staterooms. The old gentleman opened a shutter and threw the full light upon another old picture, from whose cracked surface he deliberately swept away the dust with the rusty sleeve of his fur-lined coat. I approached it. "This is not a bad picture," I said at once. "By no means a bad picture." "Indeed," exclaimed Fa Daises. "Ah, then, perhaps I may sell it. What do you think? Is it worth much?" I smiled. "Well, it is not a Raphael," I answered, "but, considering its date, and the way people then smeared, it is quite creditable." "Ah," sighed the old fellow, much disappointed. It was a half-length, half-size portrait of a man in the costume of a latter part of the last century, a pale lilac silk coat, a pale pea-green satin waistcoat, both extremely delicate in tint, and a deep, warm-tinted amber cloak. The voluminous cravat was loosened, the large collar flapped back, the body slightly turned, and the head somewhat looking over the shoulder, Cenci fashion. The painting was uncommonly good for an Italian portrait of the 18th century, and had much that reminded me, though of course vastly inferior, technically, of Greuze, a painter I detest, and who yet fascinates me. The features were irregular and small, with intensely red lips and a crimson flush beneath the transparent bronze skin. The eyes were slightly upturned and looking sidewards in harmony with the turn of the head, and the parted lips, and they were beautiful, brown, soft, like those of some animals, with a vague, wistful depth of look. The whole had the clear grayness, the hazy, downy touch of Greuze, and left that strange, mixed impression which all the portraits of his school do. The face was not beautiful. It had something at once sullen and effeminate, something odd and not entirely agreeable. Yet it attracted and riveted your attention with its dark, warm color, rendered all the more striking for the light, pearly, powdered locks, and the general lightness and haziness of touch. "It is a very good portrait in its way," I said, "though not of the sort that people buy. There are faults of drawing here and there, but the color and touch are good. By whom is it?" Old Fa Daises, whose visions of heaps of banknotes to be obtained in exchange for the picture had been rudely cut short, seemed rather sulky. "I don't know by whom it is," he grumbled. "If it's bad and may remain here." "And whom does it represent?" "A singer. You see, he has got a score in his hand, a certain Rinaldi, who lived about 100 years ago." Fa Daises had a contempt for singers, regarding them as poor creatures who were of no good, since they left nothing behind them that could be collected, except, indeed, in the case of Madame Banti, one of whose lungs he possessed in spirits of wine. We went out of the room, and I set about my copy of that abominable old portrait of Palestrina. At dinner that day, I mentioned the portrait of the singer to my cousins, and somehow or other I caught myself using expressions about which I should not have used in the morning. In trying to describe the picture, my recollection of it seemed to differ from the original impression. It returned to my mind as something strange and striking. My cousin wished to see it, so the next morning she accompanied me to old Fadisi's palace. How it affected her, I don't know, but for me it had a queer sort of interest. Quite apart from that in the technical execution, there was something peculiar and unaccountable in the look of that face, a yearning, half-pained look which I could not well define to myself. I became gradually aware that the portrait was, so to speak, haunting me. Those strange red lips and wistful eyes rose up in my mind. I instinctively, and without well knowing why, reverted to it in our conversation. "I wonder who he was," I said as we sat in the square behind the cathedral apse, eating our ices in the cool autumn evening. "Who?" asked my cousin. "Why, the original of that portrait of old Fadisi's. Such a weird face. I wonder who he was." My cousins paid no attention to my speech, for they did not share that vague, unaccountable feeling with which the picture had inspired me. But as we walked along the silent porticoed streets, where only the illuminated sign of an inn or the chestnut roasting brazier of a fruit stall flickered in the gloom, and crossed the vast desolate square, surrounded by oriental-like cupolas and minarets, where the green bronze condottiere rode on his green bronze charger, during our evening ramble through the quaint Lombard city, my thoughts kept reverting to the picture, with its hazy downy color and curious unfathomed expression. The next day was the last day of our stay, and I went to Fadisi's palace to finish my sketch, to take leave, present thanks for my civility towards us, and inquire whether we could execute any commission for him. And going to the room where I had left my easel and painting things, I passed through the dark wriggling lobby and by the door up the 3 steps. The door was ajar, and I entered the room where the portrait was. I approached and examined it carefully. The man was apparently singing, or rather about to sing, for the red, well-cut lips were parted, and in his hand a beautiful, plump, white, blue-veined hand, strangely out of keeping with the brown, irregular face. He held an open roll of notes. The notes were mere unintelligible blotches, but I made out, written on the score, the name Ferdinando Rinaldi, 1782, and above the words, Se Regina io pastor sono. The face had a beauty, a curious irregular beauty, and in those deep soft eyes there was something like a magnetic power, which I felt, and which others must have felt before me. I finished my sketch, strapped up my easel and paint box, gave a parting snarl at the horrible blear-eyed shoulderless Palestrina, and prepared to leave. Fadisi's, who, in his snuffy fur-lined coat, the tassel of his tarnished blue skullcap bobbing over his formidable nose, was seated at a desk hard by, rose also, and politely escorted me through the passage. "By the way," I asked, "do you know an air called Sia Regina io pastor sono?" "Sia Regina io pastor sono? No, such an air doesn't exist. All airs not in his library had no business to exist, even if they did." "It must exist," I persisted. "Those words are written on the score held by the singer on that picture of yours." "That's no proof," he cried peevishly. "It may be merely some fancy title, or else it may be some rubbishy trunk air." "What is a trunk air?" I asked in amazement. "A trunk air," he explained, "was a wretched air, merely a few trumpery notes and lots of pauses, onto which great singers used formerly to make their own variations. They used to insert them in every opera they sang in, and drag them all over the world. That was why they were called trunk airs. They had no merit of their own. No one ever cared to sing them except the singer to whom they belonged. No one ever kept such rubbish as that. It all went to wrap up sausages or make curl papers, and old Fadisi's laughed his grim little cackling laugh. He then dropped the subject and said, if I had the opportunity, or one of my illustrious family, of obtaining any catalogue of musical curiosities, or attending any sales. He was still searching for the first printed copy of Guido of Arezzo's Micrologus. He had copies of all the other editions, a unique collection. There was also one specimen wanting to complete his set of Amati's fiddles, one with fleur-de-lis on the sounding board, constructed for Charles IX of France. Alas, he had spent years looking for that instrument. He would pay, yes, he, as I saw him there, he, standing before me, would pay 500 golden merengi for the violin with the fleur-de-lis. Pardon me, I interrupted rather rudely. May I see this picture again? We had come to the door up the 3 steps. Certainly, he answered. and continued his speech about the Amati violin with the fleur-de-lis, getting more and more frisky and skippery every moment. That strange face with its weird, yearning look. I remained motionless before it, while the old fellow jabbered and gesticulated like a maniac. What a deep, incomprehensible look in those eyes. Was he a very famous singer? I asked by way of saying something. He, a altro? I should think so. Do you think perhaps the singers of that day were like ours? Pooh! Look at all they did in that day. Their paper made of linen rag, no tearing that, and how they built their violins. Oh, what times those were! Do you know anything about this man? I asked. About this singer? This Rinaldi? Oh, yes, he was a very great singer, but he ended badly. Badly? In what way? Why, you know what such people are. And then youth. We have all been young, all young. And old Fadieses shrugged his shriveled person. What happened to him? I persisted, continuing to look at the portrait. It seemed as if there were life in those soft velvety eyes, and as if those red lips were parting in a sigh, a long, weary sigh. Well, answered Fadieses, this Fernando Rinaldi was a very great singer. About the year 1780, he took service with the court of Parma. There, it is said, he obtained too great notice from a lady in high favor at court, and was consequently dismissed. Instead of going to a distance, he kept hanging about the frontier of Parma, now here, now there, for he had many friends among the nobility. Whether he was suspected of attempting to return to Parma, or whether he spoke with less reserve than he should, I don't know. Basta! One fine morning he was found lying on the staircase landing of our Senator Negri's house, stabbed. Old Fadieses pulled out his horn snuff-box. Who had done it? No one ever knew or cared to know. A packet of letters, which his valet said he always carried on his person, was all that was found missing. The lady left Parma and entered the convent of the Clarice here. She was my father's aunt, and this portrait belonged to her. A common story in those days. And the old gentleman rammed his long nose with snuff. You really don't think I could sell the picture? He asked. No, I answered very decidedly, for I felt a sort of shudder. I took leave, and that evening we set off for Rome. Winthrop paused and asked for a cup of tea. He was flushed and seemed excited, but at the same time anxious to end his story. When he had taken his tea, he pushed back his irregular hair with both hands, gave a little sigh of recollection, and began again as follows. And we will leave it there for today. Chapter 3 is what I will be reading tomorrow. I hope that you are enjoying these quarantine ghost stories and that they are a nice little respite, good way to pass the time. I will be back for another video soon. Bye.